the main thing about science that you have to prove your creativity. When people think about science, people tend to think of known solutions. If you actually think about what science is, it's actually tautological that it's not all solutions that are known. Otherwise, there'll be no scientific revolutions already. The company basically works on technologies that will allow you to make durable trucking, but completely green. And at the same time, make it possible to make the fuels for those trucking. The molecule we're trying to enable as fuel is this thing called hydrogen. One of the hardest part as a scientist turned entrepreneur is letting go. So you have to start trusting your team to do things on your behalf.
I'm really excited to chat with you in particular because we don't have a lot of more research-heavy companies on the podcast and products like that. But one thing you mentioned about just the way you think about science and research is actually a way to explore creativity and test your creativity. I heard you say this in another interview. So I'm curious to hear you expand on that idea. What does that relationship look like in your perspective?
I think that when people think about science, people tend to think of known solutions. Yeah, I can solve this equation, or it's just something that should be known, right? All science problems are solvable, right? But if you actually think about what science is at the edge, it's actually tautological that it's not all solutions that are known. Otherwise, there'll be no scientific revolutions already, right? So I think you've heard me spoken about it in the context of, say, water. So I'll use the same explanation again today, right? If you think about how we discovered the structure of water, right? Effectively, if I gave you a cup of water right now and you looked at it, right? Would you ever envision, you're like, you know what? Actually, I bet the water is actually this thing that is one oxygen, two hydrogens, and it's not actually even touching each other, and it's actually colliding with each other at a particular time, and then they hit themselves and somehow get this amorphous blob, and somehow everything stays together. And it manifests as this physical thing that we now call water.
Yeah.
Okay, no, if you told anyone that, no one would believe you. They'll think you're crazy. But it takes some amount of imagination for you to actually come up with that. But I think the thing that people forget is that the difference between science and pure creativity is that it takes creativity for you to come up with that visualization. And then it takes the scientific method, which is actually the main thing about science, that you have to prove your creativity.
Yeah.
Now, it's one thing to be like, the world is like this. It's another thing to say, the world's like this. Here's the experiment, and go, I told you, I'm right. It's as crazy as it sounds. I'm right.
And when you think about the scientific method in companies or even industries like yours, which are emerging technologies, how well are they, or how much testing are they doing? When we think about it, is it like 1 to 2 to 3 tests, or is it in a plethora of tests in a lab that we just don't see the mechanics behind? What does that actually look like when we're from the outside, but actually inside looking out?
It's a lot. So every data point basically has to be repeated, at least triplicates, more like 5 samples or 5 to 10 per data point. So it's a lot of data, right? Because at the end of the day, until automation becomes like a fully full-blown thing, there's always human error, right? And you can never be sure if as a result, it's just Gary has good hands. The classic example in science is always, I do an experiment and it works perfectly, and then my coworker does it and they're like, it doesn't work. And you're like, what is it? Gary and his magic hands? Like, that doesn't make any sense. So then you have to basically repeat the experiment. So it's not just how much you have to do testing again just by Gary. It's how much testing is done by Gary and then by 3 people, and then be like, okay, good. If everyone can do this experiment and everyone can repeat this truth or this results, then you have the beginnings of basically scientific discoveries, right? And that's why scientific discoveries are so hard to come by, because I think a lot of people also, you ever see those, I'll digress a little bit, you ever see those news stories where they go, we have now found evidence that maybe wine would improve your sex life or something like that, right? Something very catchy, right? And then they'll cite this one paper, right? That's like, here's the data, right? But most scientists recognize, they're like, you'll have one paper on it, right? But it's going to take another 1,000 before this thing becomes a scientific truth. There's a very difference between a hypothesis, and this might have credibility, to saying, no, this is how reality works, right? There's actually very few theories in the world. And I think one of the beauties of going to school for science, when you get a physics degree and stuff, you're taught all those theories and you're taught all those realities of life.
Yeah.
But I would think that looking back at my own education, it would have been really nice if someone told me like, oh yeah, by the way, here are all the things we know about the world. Oh, and here are all the things we have no idea. And then that would have been really useful, right? Because it
Right.
takes some of the certainty out of it. And
Mm.
then when it comes time for you to actually go further into science, right? So it actually helps to unlock your creativity, because
Yeah.
you have to remember too, right? A lot of times in scientific theories, you always think you're right. And then 50 years later, someone comes in and goes, actually,
Yeah.
yeah, that wasn't exactly what it is. And you're like, oh, damn it. I thought I was right for
Yeah.
50 years.
Yeah. It's interesting with a company like yours because how your technology develops is counterintuitive to company building as it's been popularized, right? Grow as fast as I can, acquire customers, gain revenue,
Yep.
only raise money for things that will bring you more revenue, right?
Yeah.
More revenue streams.
Yeah.
Describe the relationship now that companies like yours have with funding and how it's really changed the emerging technology space and discovering these new ways to, find products that will have a long-term effect. And obviously this bleeds into what Celadyne does and what your
Yeah.
technology is about.
Yeah. So in order to give you how all those things play together, I feel like I have to tell you what the company does. So let's
Please.
start there. So the company basically works on technologies that will allow you to make durable trucking, but completely green. And at the same time, make it possible to make the fuels for those trucking. So
Yeah.
the molecule we're trying to enable as fuel is this thing called hydrogen. Not crazy, right? That the sun is fueled by it. But you can't actually find hydrogen on Earth. You have to make it by splitting water, right? And this
Mm.
thing that you use to turn hydrogen into energy is this thing called a fuel cell, right? I think Elon Musk infamously called it a fuel cell, right? And then this thing that you use to convert water to hydrogen is this thing called an electrolyzer. And the process is called electrolysis. It was invented almost 200 years ago, right? The only problem with
Wow.
these devices is that they were never really very efficient. And our first attempt at making them workable and usable was actually when NASA did it. So one of the earliest space shuttles and so forth were actually using hydrogen technologies. Yes.
Wow.
So they actually
As
Google
propulsion or
life support for creating electricity. Because
really?
back in the
Wow.
day, there was no lithium ion batteries. So you can't use lead acid batteries or anything like your Duracell batteries in space. There's just not enough power. So they didn't have a choice. So they used fuel cells and electrolyzers. The space station today, they still use electrolyzers to make oxygen so that people can
Wow.
breathe. Yeah, so it's really old technology. The only problem is it's not good enough if you try to use it on Earth. So unless it's like a life-saving thing like the space station or like you're trying to go to the moon and cost doesn't matter, get the mission done type situations,
Right.
you won't use this technology, right?
Yeah.
So what we came up with where we're like, okay, the fundamentals were there. The science of how these devices work were there. But there were quite a few bottlenecks that you still had to solve before you can actually make these technologies fully viable, right?
Right.
With a fuel cell and electrolyzer, a lot of its performance actually is dictated by one or two things in it. Everything else is almost secondary. As with life, there's always that one or two things that
Right.
affect 80% of the outcome. And then everything else, you're kind of like, it's important, but really I should focus on these things, right?
Yeah.
And there was this thing, it's called a material, it's called the proton exchange membrane, right? Scientists are not very good at naming things. So whenever you go, what does the proton exchange membrane does? I'll tell you, it exchanges protons.
Protons.
You're like, oh, wow. Wow, that's like the worst answer possible. But it is
Yeah.
true. It exchanges protons, right? So DuPont invented this for NASA in the 70s to
Yeah.
enable the space shuttle missions. And then we haven't improved on it since, which sounds
Why do you
crazy.
think that is?
We've tried. We've spent billions of dollars trying.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's not from a lack of effort. Every year we've tried 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010, we tried. And I guess was one of the ones who tried, basically, in my PhD, right? The only difference was occasionally, as you keep trying, your attempts are studded with these successes. So it happened once in the 2000s, and that one formed a company on high temperature fuel cells. And now I'd like to think that it happened again. And that's why Celadyne came into existence, right?
Yeah.
I would love to take credit and be like, oh my God, Gary invented this amazing thing. That's whatever you want to call it. But the truth of these companies, Celadyne included in this category, is that it's luck. You're standing on the shoulder of giants. Enough people have
Yeah.
made enough progress. And then suddenly all of it came together and you're like, okay, now you have this kind of quantum of improvement. There's a big enough improvement that it makes
Yeah.
sense to commercialize and innovate on and form into a company because it would help improve the field. Because if you
Yeah.
go around right now in my field, for instance, and you told people like, hey, if you could make this material work, will it improve these devices? Then answers is always a unanimous yes, it will. How you make these materials work, that's the billion-dollar question, right? No one knows, right? So
Right.
that's the really long-winded answer to your question, right? So once you have these materials going, right? I've spent my PhD building it and everything. Now I want to turn it into a company. Why is that different from like the other kind of ideas of I'm gonna just form a company and kind of assemble a team of engineers or coders and stuff and build a company, right? The difference is that with my field with hard tech startup, usually those inventions are effectively people have spent billions of dollars in the research of it. The counter argument is if you wanted to build a company like Celadyne, right?
Hmm.
And you say, I'm just gonna engineer my way out of it. It's possible, but you might have to spend $1 billion plus all those engineers over 20 years, and then maybe you would have the same solution. It's very
Rather than going your approach, which is research first, leading
correct.
into in a technology. Yeah.
If there was some other way to predict, for instance, like in order to invent this thing and solve this scientific problem, I need to spend $20 billion and 10 years.
Yeah.
If there was a way to know that, then by all means do it, right? But to my knowledge
Right.
so far, that's close to impossible to predict. And because
Yeah.
of that, you end up having to do the fundamental science first and figuring out all the research. And once the research is ready, then you can do the commercial phase, which is to invent the product and then commercialize the product.
And what made you go that direction versus continue researching in this domain further and further, trying to advance and maybe spend years doing it? What made you think, okay, I think right now is the time to commercialize it and make it more applicable? Is it because you mentioned it, I think, that it would lead to the industry growing. So I'm curious on how commercializing it now versus continuing to advance the technology until it's, I don't know, better and better.
Yeah. I think of it as there were two pieces of it, right? The first one is an ethical morality piece, a little bit philosophical. The second one is a commercial piece. So I'll start with the ethics of it. So let me tell you a story and so that you can understand my position, right? Imagine, so you're Julian, right? And you've worked on a field, okay? And you are just the most recent person who has been working on this field. Let's just make it a family business. Your father did this, your grandfather did this, your great-grandfather did this, and they've been trying to crack this problem and they have never succeeded in cracking it, but they're super close. And you're just the last one, right? And you know you'll have a kid. And if you fail, you give that kid the same knowledge that you had and be like, your turn, keep going, right? Then one day you wake up and you realize you cracked it. Okay? So you solved the
Yeah.
problem. And you know that this thing has huge commercial potential. It'll change lives. It might even solve climate change. It'll save the world. Would you ignore it and do research, or would you commercialize it?
Fair point.
Exactly. There's almost a little bit of an ethical, moral argument to be like, I didn't choose to be the one who
Stumbled on it.
discovered this on anything.
Yeah.
Fully acknowledge that it's actually a little serendipity. All the stars aligned and here it is. But
Right.
now that it's in your hands, you have at least a ethical, moral obligation to bring it to the market, to try to
Right.
see what impact you can actually deliver. That's number
Yeah.
one, right? Number two was when I founded a company in 2018/early 2019, this innovation was in this field of effectively hydrogen. And there were a lot of companies that were doing batteries at the time, right? Lithium-ion batteries was the thing. You can easily get funding as a company to do lithium-ion batteries. But when I started the company, I actually cold called about 25 investors. And of those 25, I think 21 told me hydrogen would never be a thing, never start a company in hydrogen because it's a dead end. It's crazy because now in 2024, hydrogen is all you talk about. The DOE the Department of Energy is investing billions into it. Everyone's raving it's going to be the thing that will save the world, right? But
Yeah.
in 2019, I actually saw that potential for hydrogen only because you can do the Excel sheet for what it will take to fully decarbonize energy and very quickly realize that you would need an improvement for batteries that is like 1,000-fold before you can actually fix the energy problem.
Yeah.
So it was simple math, right? You can do. Okay, side caveat. My PhD actually involves battery research as well. So by the time I made that spreadsheet, I was like, I know what the state of the art is for batteries. So I knew I could be wrong on batteries, but I was pretty certain I wasn't 1,000 times wrong. And I was like, if I had a better idea and how I could invent a battery that was 1,000 times better, I would have done that, but I didn't.
Yeah.
Right? So then after that, I started listing every other thing. And I was like, okay, if batteries isn't the solution forward, what are my other options? Number 2, I listed fusion. And I was like, ooh, I don't know if I can fix fusion, right? Someone else might figure fusion out,
Yeah.
but that's not me, right? So then the third one was hydrogen. So then I was like, okay, interesting, right? So now going back to the earlier thing I told you about hydrogen fuel cells being terrible and electrolyzers being really inefficient. And to Elon's comment, like full fuel cells are full cells, right?
Why is that? Is it the amount of energy that it takes to exchange protons?
Correct. The amount of energy, if you put a hydrogen molecule in there, how much energy you get out, right? The hydrogen stores a particular amount of energy in its bonds. And you ask yourself, once you break it apart, how much energy you get out of it? And you realize it's 50% efficient, right? It's pretty terrible, right?
Yeah.
In that sense, Elon was right. It was terrible. But he's also the one that's famously said, you should always think from first principles. So then if you take a step forward and you take a physics approach to it, which is what he likes to do, and you say, is there a reason why fuel cells suck? And the answer is no. There isn't, actually. As opposed to, say, if you look at an engine, you're like, an engine is, say, 25%, 30% efficient. Why is it so inefficient? And you say, there's a limit called the Carnot efficiency. Literally, you cannot make it more efficient than about 30+%. That's the limit, right? Wow. But for fuel cells, because they're electrochemical engines, there is no reason why they should be so bad. The only reason why they're so bad is because no one solved the materials problems. No one's put in the engineering time to fix all those little high friction points to make something good, right? So now going back to if you're a researcher, you have to be a guy who is like glass half full, not half empty. So when someone tells you this is 50% efficient, it sucks. What you should go is, this is 50% efficient. I have so much room left to improve it. I bet I can get it to 90, right? And so then you start the company. Because going back to our story about 2018, right? I thought, if you really believe that hydrogen was a necessary solution to save the world and fix climate change, right?
Yeah.
And 21 people have told you not to do it, and then you look around the world and you realize no one is doing it, then you go, if no one's doing it and no one's funding to do it, though, so even if I do it, it's one more shot on goal.
Yeah.
And that's worth it, right? If there were 1,000 people doing it and you're the 1,001, then maybe, you're like, it's fine. I can just go get a job. Someone else will fix this problem. But if there's only 10 people doing it and you're the 11th person and you're like, okay, no, maybe I should do this because there's a chance, really high chance that this might never get fixed if I don't try. And I thought to myself, I still remember that day when I thought to myself, I was like, if I started a company, and if at the very least, all I did was I could convince someone else to do it, and they start their own company or etc., and even if they succeed and say my company fails, it would have still been worth it, because maybe if I hadn't started a company, which then resulted in me talking to them, which then resulted in them starting a company, and then they have succeeded, and they would have happened, and then now the whole world is screwed in 50 years.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, you have to remember the mission of why you're doing this. It wasn't just to make money. It was to advance a cause, and the cause here was to fix climate change once and for all. Otherwise, we're all screwed. They succeed. At the end of the day, I'm like, yeah, this would have been worth it.
Right.
2018, I started a company.
It's amazing because I had another founder on the show who was really adamant about thinking of the dream rather than the mission of the company, because a mission you can poke holes in, you can find an opposition to it, but a dream, it's completely, it's personal, it's intimate, but it's also, it's almost impervious to that type of, I guess, pushback because of how it's constructed and how much energy and motivation it gives. And also, you can take away the personal impact of where your progress lands and just continue moving forward. And it is fascinating to hear your commitment to this problem in particular. I'm first of all, I'm happy that you found the breakthrough so you can build a company a company around it. But just to even like further understand the breakthrough in particular, and then we'll move on obviously to the
Mhm,
application of
mhm,
Celadyne and what you're going to be using the product for and how it's going to be implemented. What is that breakthrough? Was it how did you make it more efficient for the proton exchange process?
mhm,
And is there any waste in there, or is it fully recyclable system
mhm.
for
Yeah.
those who don't?
Oh, yeah, so that's a good point. So I'll address your first point about the dream versus the mission first. I agree with you, but I think I have a different idea. I think I've never heard of it described that way, but I think about it in the same perspective.
Mm,
I think for a company, for future founders, I think of it sometimes as a founder, you're expected to define the mission for your organization, for your company. But I actually would challenge future founders not to just define the mission for their company, but what they should be doing is actually to define the mission for their field, right? Which is not just your company, it's actually a cohort of companies. Because at the end of the day, if you're serious about changing the world, you're not going to do it alone and you're going to need partners. And your partners are not going to work with you if the mission you are defining for the field is misaligned with what they want for the whole field. Let me give you an example, right? In my field, hydrogen, our whole goal has always been to like decarbonize energy. That's it. It's pretty simple, right? And the only reason why we're using hydrogen is because we believe that is the way path forward. It's
right.
also the reason why, at least for us in Celadyne, when people put us against batteries and they're like, oh, it's batteries versus hydrogen, hydrogen will be a thing, batteries will be a thing. And I always tell people, I don't care. I care about decarbonizing energy. If you find a better way to do it, power be to you, good for you,
Yeah.
right? That's the true idea of energy, right? Is to actually decarbonize energy. I don't really care how you do it. Now,
Right.
obviously, don't do something super unethical and kill a bunch of people, right? As long as it's not really unethical, I don't really care the
Yeah.
technology you use to decarbonize energy. Just
Right.
decarbonize energy, right? So that's the dream versus the company mission, right? Okay, now to your point about technology and how we basically invented it, right? So when you look at kind of technology and you're trying to invent something, or rather you're trying to improve something, right? You start by just doing a very quick analysis and say what part of it is terrible and what part of it do people never work on. Going back to our story about NASA, right? It was
Right.
very clear that the membranes, and actually the membranes and the catalysts, were the things that people were working on but couldn't really fix for a lot longest time. Our key insight that basically led to the company was actually two pieces. So the first one, which is the actual breakthrough and the invention, is in order to make these things really good, you have to do three things. You have to be able to run these things hotter. You actually have to enable the hydrogen and the oxygen to be more compartmentalized. Because
Mm,
hydrogen is such a small molecule, even if you have a layer in the middle that's like a barrier layer, which is what the membrane does, a little bit of the hydrogen will cross it. And once
yeah.
it crosses it, it'll react with the oxygen. I don't need to tell you that hydrogen and oxygen is actually an explosive mixture. It's a bad idea. And the third one is actually because a fuel cell creates water, you have to be able to make it operate at slightly lower humidity. Because if you don't have it operate at lower humidity, all that water that you're generating is liquid water and that clogs up all the pores and is really bad for the engineering. But the third piece, even if you don't solve from a scientific standpoint, you can solve from an engineering standpoint. So really it's the first two pieces. But we think of it as a three-part problem. You can argue it's actually a two-part problem. That's fine. So we invented that material, something that will let you bring the temperature up higher, blocks hydrogen better, and can go slightly lower in humidity.
Yeah.
That was the invention in 2019. And this is where it gets really interesting. Okay. So there's the scientists invented this amazing product. The maximum size of the material we could make was about yay big, kind of like an inch by an
Eh,
inch. That's all, an inch by an inch, right? And you're like, wow, this is going to take decades to commercialize. And then we got accepted into Argonne National Lab to commercialize this technology, got paid like $500,000 and with lab space with amazing mentorship, hired 5 people. And then February 2020 happened. Yeah, we literally hired 5 people in February 2020,
Wow.
February 20th, 2020. And then maximum payroll. And then the whole world shut down on us.
Crazy.
March. Yeah, March. I tell people all the time, I'm like, man, if I had to write a book, chapter 1 would be amazing.
Yeah.
I was like, you can't make this up. You're like, I can't believe this. And there was a point in the
Getting to
the
a
company's
saga.
yeah, the company's accounts literally had $5,000 left in the bank in the bank account. And it was like, I don't think I can make payroll next month. Seriously, I don't think I can make
Wow.
payroll next. My co-founder and I basically had to put in our savings to save the company, which is crazy. But okay, but here's the beauty of it though. Okay, you have this amazing material with these properties, and now you have no lab, but you have
Yeah.
employees. So if you do something, right? We sent everyone out and we spoke to our customers and we said, okay, developing a product that has all three properties, even as amazing as it is and everything, first of all, we can't really do it anymore because we don't have a lab,
Yeah.
right? So let's take a page from software and say, rank order these things. If I could only realize one of these properties and then the second and then the third, which one would you pick?
Yeah.
Because we already knew, right? Realizing all three properties would take a long time to commercialize. But if I dumbed it down and I only have to make one of it real,
Mm-hmm.
it's 6 months, right? The problem is it's not 6 months, it's 6 months, it's 6 months.
What did you dumb down? Or I guess, what did you minimize? Is it like highlighting a certain part of the offering or a certain part of the technology to easily communicate it versus saying,
Exactly.
like, you have everything. Yeah.
It's highlighting a specific part of the technology from a physical science standpoint. Basically, you're like,
Mhm.
I have this, if you want to call it a Nobel Prize winning material, whatever, right? But then now you're basically, it hurts as a scientist to be like, I've made this amazing thing, and now I'm going to purposely do things in a way that will sacrifice its properties and make it a crappier material in some ways.
Wow.
But
Yeah.
it will work for that one thing, right? It's almost like I said, you have three things, but I'm going to purposely kill two properties and make it only good at one thing. Hurts. As an inventor, that's a big sacrifice.
Yeah.
But so we spoke to our customers and then they were like, actually, Gary, you got it right. All three things are really important. But if you don't fix number one, which is ended up being the hydrogen separations problem, if you
Mhm.
don't get me a material that will be better at blocking hydrogen, so to speak, I don't care about 2 or 3. Because number 2 and 3 are basically, if you enable 2 and 3, you will improve efficiency. Number 1 is safety.
Mhm.
I don't care if it's more efficient
Yeah.
if it's not safe.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah. Especially today. Yeah.
Makes sense, right? Like in hindsight, once I tell you the story, you're kind of like, did you even need to talk to people to understand this thing? It's obvious, right? Yeah, hindsight's 2020, right? But at the time when you look at it, you're like, oh yeah, they're all important. Efficiency is really important. Safety is really important. We'll just do all of it. And then they're
Yeah.
like, actually, what your customer has told you is, "Yeah, I'm willing to tolerate a lower efficiency if you can make this product more safe. Because once the
Yeah.
product's more safe, I can make a product that my customers will buy. And they're willing to work with me and gradually roll in something that's more efficient over time."
Yeah.
So keep in mind here the story. We're in the middle of COVID right now, and you got this information. So
Yeah.
then you go back to your technical team and you go,
What do you do?
scrap the
Yeah.
other
How do
two
you?
things. Only work on the first thing. Scrap the other two things. Only work on the first thing. But here's the thing though. Only work on the first thing and you have no lab. So find
Are
some
you gonna?
random office space, some biohacking space that only allows you to do chemistry using literally beakers and cups with water and figure it out. Literally figure it out. You got a PhD in chemistry, figure it out. There's no other way around this, right? Company's got to operate. You're going to get a paycheck. We got to make this work. And we did. So we, in 6 months, translated all the chemistries that was previously very complicated solvents like hydrocarbons and kind of petroleum looking into just water-based systems because that was all we could do. We were in an office space that didn't have proper ventilation and we didn't want to put a bunch of oils in here. That's really scary. So we're like, I can handle water. I'm not okay with everything else. And then at some point we went to we can handle water, we can handle ethanol because that's vodka. That's not gonna kill anyone. We translated all the chemistries to aqueous chemistries and it worked. And we actually ended up showing that new material that's dumbed down purely based on aqueous chemistries. And that's actually the product we're commercializing. All the while knowing that it's a dumbed down version of the product. And we will eventually come back and revisit number 2 and number 3 once number 1 is done. But turns out number 1 is as valuable as what people say it is because we have now shipped that material to all the tier 1 OEMs, the automotive makers. They're integrating that material into their products as what that person has said. It's if
These,
we face this problem, we will want it.
yeah, yeah, and are these automotive, are they larger trucks and are they commercial?
You've heard of them. You know
Yeah,
most of their names, but I cannot name them in a public setting
right,
because we have NDAs. But if you ask
um,
yourself, you're like, which automaker has done a big gamble on hydrogen? And then you go, which one in Canada? You're like, okay, there aren't that many, so you can guess.
that you had to simplify the product, focus on one particular pain point versus you can solve everything. It's so interesting. Is that like from an adoptability? Is that more like human psychology, or is it cheaper? Is it easier to integrate? Is it a easier bet for them to take? What were the reasons they were like, if you focus on this one thing, that's our biggest pain point?
Yeah, simple. Because of three things. The first one, by focusing it down to one pain point, it's a lot easier to communicate.
Mm.
You go to your customer, they're like, what do you fix? And you're like, this. I'm like, oh, cool. As opposed to this, and this. And
Right.
then you basically, human psychology goes, when I tell you three things, now I have to think about it and be like, which one's actually important to me? Whereas
Yeah.
it's all one problem for you that you can just decide, like, is this important to me or is this not important to you? So that's number one. It's a communications thing. Number two, I think of it as whenever you you create value for a customer, it's never equal value. When you have three
Yeah.
things, it's always, I really believe in the 80-20 rule. One of those things hold 80% of the value. The other two holds 20% of the value, right? And you focus on the first one that delivers the most value because then your customer gets the most value. It's quite
Right.
simple there, right?
Right.
But you can also measure value because one of the things when we were doing the discovery with them was at some point during the conversation, I'll be like, what are you up to these days in your research labs? And they're like, oh, they'll tell you a story like, oh man, my experiment didn't work yesterday, blah, blah, blah. And you get friendly and you're like, what experiment are you doing? And they're like, oh yeah, we're trying to do this thing. We're trying to solve this problem. I'm like, oh, you're trying to solve this problem. Okay, what's the problem you're trying to solve? They're like, oh yeah, there's this thing. The material sucks. It's just leaking hydrogen all the time, this, that, whatever. And I'm like, oh, and how long have you been trying to solve this problem? And they're like, 2 years.
Wow.
Oh, I can't wait for the day when someone like solves this problem for me. I'm like, okay, interesting.
Yeah.
I go, wow, I really feel bad for you. And you really do, right? It's like someone's struggling for 2 years to solve this problem. They're frustrated. Then 6 months
Right.
later, you come back, you're like, hey, Bob, I solved this problem.
And he's like, no way.
Yeah,
No.
exactly. They're like, no way. I'm like, no, actually, though, here's the data. And they're like,
Yeah.
how did you do it? I was like, I won't tell you how I did it, but I have the thing that solves the problem. Do you want to buy it?
Right.
And how
Right.
much it going to cost me? And I'm like, not that much, couple
Yeah.
$1,000. And they're like, done. Send me the product.
And this how a lot of the innovation happens in spaces like this, where it's these micro changes that most people are solving this one particular or few particular problems. An organization makes that leap and everybody tackles on to a new standard of how this technology should run. And then it continues. Is that typically how we see things like this be adopted? And is this the right way, or is this the best way to do it? Or would you personally rather have seen somebody take the whole three solution product and actually implement that?
I think this is the right way to do it. Just the short answer,
Yeah.
right? Because I think that if you try to implement all three at the same time, right? First of all, the company will probably fail because it takes too much resources,
Right.
right? You'll lose focus. And the scary thing is always the method, right? It's that you would have commercialized that product with no customer input.
Yeah.
One of the things I always try to, so these days we're a little bit far along in our founder journey. So there are some early founders like year 1, year 2, they'll come and ask me for advice because they'll be like, oh man, what should I sell? Blah, blah, blah. And then I always ask the opposite. I'll be like, what does your customer want?
Yeah.
And then he's like, we make this catalyst or whatever. I was like, you haven't answered my question yet.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
what does your customer want? And then they'll be like, oh no, they want like a platinum catalyst that can do XYZ. And I was like, why do they want that? And they're like, I don't know. They just say they wanted it. I was like, go back and talk to your customer. It's like, you have to actually not just understand what your customer wants on the surface. You have to understand why your customer wants it.
Right.
It's not what
Yeah.
they want, it's why they want it. Because
Yeah.
if you only understand what they want, then you're back to the Henry Ford problem where you're like, oh yeah, here's a faster horse. But
Right.
if you understand why they want it, then you can deliver something that will truly wow them. Using the Henry Ford example, right? It's like, what did the customer want? Oh, they want a faster horse. No, they don't want a faster horse. They want to get from A to B. That's all they care about, getting from A to B.
Yeah.
They don't care if it's a car or a horse or a rocket. They just want to get A to B, right?
Right.
And then the metric that you care about is time, right? If you can get me from A to B as fast as possible, as convenient as possible, I will buy your product.
Yeah.
Right? And once you understand that, then you are finally ready to build a product, right?
Right.
I think of it sometimes as a scientist coming into commercialization, right? You always want to build the product that you have invented because there's a strong emotional attachment to it. But you forget that this thing has to meet the market, and there's a second Venn diagram, which is the product that the market wants. And your job as entrepreneur is to find the overlap between those two things and then make a product there. Actually, there's a third Venn diagram, which is there's a product that you have invented, there's a product the customer wants, and then the third one is there's a product you can build the business around. Can you make it profitable and self-sustaining? Find the intersection of those two things, and that's when you make then you make your company around that thing.
Yeah. Man, it's incredible to think about how when this is adopted widely, what it will have in terms of its effect. But what gets you to that point where you see more companies adopting this technology? Do you need more companies to take this type of bet? Or are there enough out there where we can see a significant change if they start using the materials you have to, for their fleets? I'm assuming there's fleets of trucks. What do you need to get to that point?
So right now, like this material, so I've spent a lot of time talking about the trucking side of things, right? Because that's the immediate traction we've already done. Like we've shipped it to the OEMs, but the material actually lets you make hydrogen a lot cheaper too, right? Which is really important because making hydrogen cheaper is how you unlock new markets. Effectively, no one will buy diesel at $15 a gallon, right? But people will definitely buy diesel at $3 a gallon. It's the same thing with hydrogen. No one will buy it at $15 per kilogram. But if we, for instance, with our technology, can get it down to $2 or $3 per kilogram, people will use it for new applications, right?
Yeah.
And you need to do that if you're serious about decarbonization for like things like trucking or steel or cement or things that require a lot of heat. Because one of the things you can't really do very efficiently with a battery, you can do induction heating to a limit, but when the scale gets really, really big, induction heating isn't viable, right? So one of the things that our technology does is also making hydrogen much cheaper. But going to your point of what do you need to actually get the traction to evolve, right? So we've already shipped the materials. Our next step is actually to scale up these materials into rolls and rolls of these things. So we can deliver these things to more of our like OEM partners, kind of like the Toyotas of the world, right? And then they can integrate it into fuel cells that go into trucks. So make more, right? On the side, we're basically starting to do these pilots with these utilities to basically understand when you think about making hydrogen, right? You have a brand new material, but then you have to put this into a product that will actually make hydrogen. And we're trying to help them understand, kind of going back to our dumbing down exercise, right? Again, you can think of it as that's effectively what we're doing again. We have this amazing material and you say, okay, this thing can help you make hydrogen cheaper. Yeah. And then most people will say, make it as cheap as you can, okay? But the way we look at it from our side is like, why do you want it so cheap? What are you trying to do with it? And when you say you want it cheap in what way, right? Because there's a difference between you want the hydrogen cheap because the thing making hydrogen is expensive, or you want hydrogen cheap because the thing you're using to make hydrogen is actually really cheap, but the electricity is really expensive, right? Or something about it. Transmission of hydrogen is really expensive, right? Because in one case, I'll make a box that's cheap. In another case, I'll make you a box that's really expensive, but I'll put it next to the thing that uses hydrogen and that reduces the cost, right? So it's like, what is it that you want, right? Like all you have said is you want hydrogen really cheap, but you haven't actually told me in what way do you want to make hydrogen cheap and why you want to make it cheap. So we're doing those kind of those conversations and those pilots with the utilities right now so that we can really understand the hydrogen market. And once we crack that nut, we're going to redo the whole strategy. I was like, okay, so I'm going to build you exactly what you want. Right? Yeah. That will let us revolutionize hydrogen production as fuel.
Yeah.
And if you put it together at the end of the day, going back to the mission statement, right? What are you trying to do? You're trying to decarbonize and fix climate change, right? If you can make the heavy duty people cooperate and make heavy duty trucks and they all run on fuel cells, you would have effectively decarbonized all of trucking. That would be amazing, right? just think about it, right? A heavy duty truck that's currently diesel power, it'll run down the freeway in about 10 years and it'll have no emissions, right? Um, just imagine that. I tell people, if sometimes people have a hard time understanding and viscerally feeling that, I tell people all the time, here's how you should think about a heavy duty truck today, okay? On a per mile basis, every time a heavy duty truck goes down a freeway, every mile, you should just imagine the heavy duty truck pooping out a pound of like a bag of flour, but instead of the
Yeah.
flour, the flour is carbon. That's
Yeah.
literally what it is. You just imagine this thing pooping out like a chunk of flour that's black, like pop, 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 pop,
Yeah.
pop. That's effectively what's happening. Okay?
Yeah.
That's crazy, right? But that's effectively what's happening. Now, but in 10 years, no more. Instead of that chunk of carbon that comes out, it will just be water vapor, which is just
Mhm.
water. If they successfully do that, then it'll be a point in their evolution where you have so many trucks that need so much hydrogen, they'll start complaining because they'll be like, oh man, we're using so much hydrogen, we're running out of supply and we need this to be cheaper. Because
Yeah.
otherwise, if the demand's high, the supply is not sustaining, prices go up. And that's why we're working with the people making hydrogen to be like, here's technology to help you make hydrogen cheaper, help you scale, help you
Right.
reduce the cost. Because that way, these folks who are willing to buy a ton of hydrogen now, you can be like, that's good.
Yeah.
Sign a long-term agreement, we'll make bigger scale. And if they keep talking and they keep working together, you'll have a bigger market, you have a bigger supply, the cost goes down, then other people go, wait a second, the cost is lower now, I can use this for shipping, and I can use this for steel. And then these guys
Right.
go, we can make it even bigger, we can sell even more hydrogen. And then next thing you know, these guys are profitable, these other guys are profitable, and when it's all said and done, right, you in some ways have capitalism working for you in this case. And
Mhm.
then 2050, 2060, suddenly you go, oh wait, no more climate change. You're not using diesel anymore. You're actually using hydrogen. But the difference is this time when you do it this way, you didn't force people to give up on diesel, right? You gave them a truly superior technology that is
Right.
just better. So they're like, we're switching because it's just better.
Better.
And
Yeah.
and that's what you need to do.
Yeah. Gary, that's a great way to transition to this next part of the podcast. I know we're coming into the end here, but some rapid fire questions for you personally. I love the
Right.
mission. I love the dream of what you're building. And it's exciting to see how you can create one piece of technology and affect both sides of the marketplace and the supply and demand, because you would hate that one would restrict the other from growing. But I won't go too much further into that. On a personal level, what is hard for you day to day, being both invested in the science side, but also running a business, learning the mechanics of selling and kind of build partnerships and really getting out there? What's the hardest part for you day to day?
I think one of the hardest part as a scientist turned entrepreneur is letting go.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the problems of being a really good scientist is you always want to do everything yourself. You're like, you always think, I am the best experimentalist. I can do this. But your employee does something, I can do this 5 times faster. Whatever. Right. And
Right.
at some point you have to realize you're like, no, I have to let go, because you have to start trusting your team to do things on your behalf. Right. Otherwise you will never succeed in building a company. You have to learn to let go at some point. And I joke sometimes it's taken me years to learn this, which is now when people show me data, I can actually accept data as like real, as opposed to me poking holes in there and be like, I bet you didn't do this thing, or I bet you didn't do that thing, and everything, right? But one of the unintended consequences is if you start trusting your employees and start trusting your team, it is only then that they'll be able to step up, right? Because if you can't trust them, they know you don't trust them. I guarantee you they won't try very hard, because they're like, what's the point of trying? Gary's going to end up redoing this himself anyways.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. It's that trust.
True.
Right.
So that's one of the hardest things, letting go so that you can actually learn to trust your team.
And what is something you do outside of running the company? Obviously, most founders, their company is their life and there's no separation between. But I think most of us realize we have to separate and find other hobbies and things. What do you spend your time doing?
I love cooking.
Yeah. All right. What kind of food? Tell me. Cuisine. Give me the
everything. Everything. I love baking, making bread, making desserts and things like that. My fiance complains because someone's got to eat it, and now I'm getting fat. But that's besides the point. No, I love cooking. One day I used to tell people like if I wasn't doing Celadyne, I probably would have a very scientific food blog. Um,
Really?
yeah, I remember I'm the guy who basically back in grad school, I remember there was
Uh,
these 30 days where my coworkers were very happy and unhappy at the same time because I would spend 30 days and every day I would make a batch of biscotti. But then like
wow.
Monday, I would make like biscotti with like flour of a particular protein content. Tuesday, I'll make it with a different protein content. Wednesday, it'll be with eggs. Thursday, it was just no butter, but with oil and
Now you
everything.
just don't tell me you had a survey for people to tell you
Pretty
in
much.
feedback.
Yeah,
Oh
pretty
my
much. Because
god.
I was trying to optimize the perfect recipe. So there'll be days when
Yeah.
you're like, wow, this biscotti is so good. And next day you're like, this is like the worst thing I've ever eaten. And then it would just be like fluctuating everywhere. And then by day 30, I'll be like, I got it. It's the
Did you
perfect
find?
recipe. Yeah. And I
Yeah.
remember sharing this with my friend, and I was like, this is the foolproof recipe. I've tested this to death. If you screw this up, it's not the recipe, it's you. Like, because I spent 30 days perfecting this thing, right? I love
Okay.
doing that. But
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
like, that's how I cook, that's how I think. And I think it's really fun.
Yeah. Yeah. I always like to ask, outside of what you're doing day to day, a lot of founders read books about business. A lot of founders read books about their particular industry. Outside
Mm.
of those two things, what are some book recommendations that take you away or that you really enjoy or that motivate you? Things that, or lasted the test of time. And if not books, podcasts, something material wise.
I try to think about a book that I've read like at least 10 times.
Yeah.
There are two books. So the first one is one, it's very philosophical. It's called The Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I think it's like
Oh, yeah.
built
Yeah.
into
Yeah.
the book too, right? It's basically the essentials of stoicism as a
Right.
philosophy because it helps you keep centered because a founder's life is very chaotic and stoicism helps in that sense. The second book is the one that actually changed my perspective of business. And it's actually this book by Richard Branson called Business Stripped Bare. It's a really interesting book because there's this line in the book where he's, if you care enough about something to do something about it, then you're in business, which is very useful
Very,
because
very,
in
very rich
2016,
friend.
yeah, because when I was in 2016, if you told me you're like, Gary, you would start a business one day, I'll be like, I'm not a businessman. I don't know if
Yeah.
I'm the guy who was going to do financial modeling and things like that. When I read that quote, it really resonated because then I was like, okay, when I started a company to try to like change decarbonization and use hydrogen to decarbonize and all that stuff, right? Really, what you're doing is you're starting a company so that other people who share that ideal or mission and something can do something about the problem. Basically, you have all these aggregates of people who, when you're looking for a job for a company, especially when it comes to a startup, right? What are you actually looking for? It's not just a paycheck, right? It's you're saying, I want to do something, but I don't want to be doing it unpaid, right?
Yeah.
Find me a place where I can do something about this problem that I really care about and hopefully get paid on the way for it, right?
Yeah.
And that's effectively what Celadyne is, right? It's I wanted to decarbonize the world with hydrogen. I couldn't find a company to do it with in 2018 or 2019, so I didn't really have a choice. So I was like, all right, since that company didn't exist, I guess I have to start it. And then
Right.
since then, a bunch of people basically wanted to do the same thing, and I was like, oh, okay, Celadyne exists. I don't have to start the company. I can just join the company.
Yeah.
And that has every time I get discouraged, I read that book and there's always some little nugget of wisdom in there that I'm like, oh yeah, it helps shift your perspective. You're like, oh yeah, I'm thinking about this wrong. Extra points is if you Google really, really, really hard in Audible, you'll find a version of that book that is read by Sir Richard Branson.
Oh, really? Okay. I'll
Yeah,
have to.
way more effective because you put on your earpods and he's like narrating the book and you're like, wow, this is pretty awesome.
That's amazing, Gary. Those are pretty much all my questions. The last one I always like to ask is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have? Anything you wanted to cover that we didn't get a chance to today?
I think the only thing I would talk about is kind of Celadyne's trajectory, right? I think the company was founded in 2019, and for the most part, we've stayed silent for a long time. And then people go, "Why am I hearing about you just now? It's been like 5 years." I tell people all the time, it's like you're hearing about it rather organically because now our partners are starting to talk about it. But for the longest time, I didn't really do podcasts or do PRs and things like that because I wanted a good reason to want to do it, right? And we're doing it right now because of two reasons. Number one is we're finally at that point where it's like we need our partners and we need customers to help us change the world. Because we're like, hey, the materials are ready and everything. We need you to do this, right? Like our part is not almost done, but we're at the limits of what we can do ourselves. And so that's why we need people to be able to find us, right? Number two, it's me paying it forward. Because had you asked me to get on a podcast and kind of tell new founders what to do 3 years ago, I probably would have rejected it because I'm like, I'm pretty sure I'll give you bad advice. But now I've stepped on enough landmines where I'm like, okay, if you want me to give you some advice about, and maybe not advice, at least tell you Celadyne's story so that you can listen to it and then go, he stepped on these landmines. I definitely don't want to do that again. That kind of thing. Then I'm like, yeah, I can definitely share you those stories, and hopefully you can learn from my experience, and you would, at the very least, realize what not to do, not make those mistakes, but B, for the existing founders, recognize that, oh wow, he made all those mistakes, but he's still here and the company's still alive and we're actually doing really well. So founders are very hard on themselves when they make mistakes.
Yeah.
So hopefully, if nothing else, this one would be like, oh yeah, he really screwed up on that one, right? But that's just part of the journey, and I can live with it. And it's not the end of the world, because with a founder, sometimes it's very often you make a mistake and you're like, oh my god, it's the end of the world. My company's gonna die, right? It's, no, calm down, take a moment, take a breather.
Yeah, I think a lot of founders also have the hesitation to try some things because it's like time wasted. But all that time is spent to learn more. And once that shift happens and you're spending the time on the right thing, after spending loads of time with your customers, which I can't tell you how many times I don't know how many episodes we have to do to make sure that maybe that's the new logo or the new slogan. It's spend time with your customers, because really that's 90%, 95%, some incredible amount of percentage to what makes your business successful or product sellable or really anything. Even when you're at a standstill in your business and you have no thought of where to go, talk to your customers. They'll tell you exactly where to go.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that in your industry as well. That principle still carries on and is really just something that's led to a lot of the success you've had and your company hopefully will continue to have.
Yes. Yeah. Also important is like when you listen to your customer, actually listen and be empathetic to your customer, right? Don't don't assume that you're like, oh, your customer's got it good and they're just a check, right? Never do that, right?
Yeah.
Always try to be empathetic to your customer and be like, no, they have a real problem. I think of it all the time. Like whenever I think about a customer and I find it difficult to be empathetic to them, I'll just be like, imagine this person has a wife and kids and they're just trying to make a living. They're not trying to screw you over or anything like that, right? They're just trying to make a living and they're trying to solve a problem so that they don't get fired. So you're trying to solve a problem to them. And when they pay you, it's not that you have done some magic out of the sale or whatever, out of the deal that's like making them pay you. It's that you have actually delivered real value in their lives and they're paying you because they want to pay you. In other words, if they didn't pay you, they will feel bad about it. Because they're like, wow, Gary's really helped me out here. I'm walking away. Now I feel like a real, insert whatever expletive you want, right?
Yeah.
So they're paying you because you've actually delivered real value to their lives.
Yeah. Well, Gary, last little bit, where can we find you? Where can we be a fan? Give us your plugs, your LinkedIn's, YouTube's, Instagrams, wherever we can find and support your mission, your vision, and you as a founder.
Yeah, Celadyne's website's always there. We recently raised our $4.5 million seed round. There's a whole TechCrunch article on it, so you can read about it. We have a very long conference circuit in June. You'll find me at all the hydrogen energy conferences across Washington, Houston, Seattle, I think maybe even New York. We'll be in Climate Week in New York in September. Celadyne is hosting our very own Hydrogen Day in October in Illinois. It'll be a really great event. But yeah, or I think as a quick ping is if you're new in the startup journey and you want to chat, you can always ping me on LinkedIn. Believe it or not, I'll actually reply. So a couple people have done it already, and they're always excited.
Yeah, you replied to the invite to jump on the show, so I appreciate that. And Gary, it's been such a pleasure talking with you, learning your journey and sharing your story so that we can all grab wisdom from it. Thank you for joining Behind Company Lines today.
Happy to be here.
Of course.